The autumn morning in Portland, Maine, carried a quiet crispness, the kind that makes every fallen leaf smell faintly of earth and old secrets. Antique appraiser Sarah Mitchell stepped softly through the doorway of the grand Victorian home on Elm Street, her breath forming a pale mist in the cool air. The Whitmore estate sale had drawn collectors from every corner of New England, but Sarah's eyes, trained by years of searching for the extraordinary, wandered past the gleam of silver and polished wood. They stopped at a small mahogany table, its surface gleaming like still water. There, a modest collection of photographs waited. Sepia tones of long-ago lives' family gatherings, stiffly posed portraits, faces frozen in a silence that outlived their voices. Among them, one image seemed to lean toward her as if calling for attention. A formal studio portrait, dated 1914, captured a family of 4. The father stood tall in a dark suit, his expression as stern and immovable as a courthouse statue. Beside him, seated with the poise of another time, was a woman in a crisp white blouse, her hair swept into the elegant Gibson girl style. 2 children completed the tableau, a boy of perhaps 8, his shoes polished to a faint shine, and a girl no older than 5, her small hands folded neatly in her lap. The photograph bore the embossed seal of Hartwell Studios, Boston, one of the city's most prestigious names in photography at the time. Their clothing, their careful arrangement whispered of upper-middle-class comfort in the uneasy years before the Great War. Sarah lifted the silver frame, the cool metal pressing into her fingertips. At first glance, the composition was typical of the era, the father standing protectively behind his seated wife, the children flanking them like small sentinels. But something stirred in Sarah's mind, an almost imperceptible wrong note in an otherwise perfect chord. It was the mother. Her posture carried a quiet tension, and her left hand curved strangely, the fingers bent, not in rest, but in concealment. It was as if she were hiding something in plain sight. Interesting piece, isn't it? The voice, soft but clear, came from behind. Sarah turned to see an elderly woman approaching, her eyes bright with the familiarity of old walls. "I'm Margaret Whitmore," the woman said, introducing herself as the great-granddaughter of the home's original owners. Sarah held the photograph delicately. "Do you know anything about this family?" she asked, her professional curiosity sharpening. Margaret shook her head, the motion slow, regretful. "That photograph came with other items we inherited. I believe it belonged to a family named Patterson. Beyond that, I'm afraid I know nothing of their story." The name drifted through the room like a faint echo. Patterson. Sarah looked once more at the mother's oddly curved hand. That small, nagging detail refused to let go of her thoughts. Later, back in her quiet, downtown Portland office, Sarah placed the photograph beneath the cool glow of her professional magnifying equipment. Years of appraising antiques had taught her a simple truth. The most valuable discoveries are often the ones others overlook. She adjusted the focus, the soft whir of the lens filling the silence. The image sprang to life with startling clarity. The father's mustache gleamed with perfect wax. The children's clothes were crisp, spotless, untouched by time. But the mother's hand, Sarah leaned closer, her breath catching. Between those carefully curved fingers lay the faintest edge of white. Paper. A folded slip, hidden, yet deliberately present, like a message too dangerous to reveal and too important to abandon. Sarah's pulse quickened. In 15 years of handling objects that carried the weight of forgotten lives, she had learned that people often hide their deepest truths in plain sight, especially in times of upheaval. And 1914 was nothing if not a year of upheaval. It was the year the world tilted toward war, when families across America faced choices they could scarcely understand. She photographed the detail with her high-resolution camera, then enhanced the image on her computer. The white fragment sharpened slightly, its folds catching the light. Still, its message remained locked away. Without hesitation, Sarah reached for her phone and dialed a trusted name. James. "I have something you need to see," she said, her voice low but charged with quiet excitement. On the other end was Dr. James Reed, a historian at the University of Southern Maine, a man whose life revolved around the hidden currents of early 20th century America. A 1914 family portrait, Sarah continued. But the mother, she's hiding something in her hand, something she didn't want the world to know, but couldn't bear to let go of. "Send me the images," James replied without hesitation. 1914 was a turning point, economic unrest, war on the horizon. Whatever she's holding could tell us more than we imagine. That evening, Dr. Reed studied the high-resolution files Sarah had sent. The historian in him immediately recognized the weight of what they might have uncovered. Studio portraits of that era were exercises in control, every detail carefully staged. Nothing appeared by accident. During their meeting at the university the next morning, James traced the embossed mark at the corner of the print. "The Hartwell Studios seal is our first real clue," he explained, his voice carrying the thrill of discovery. Theodore Hartwell ran one of Boston's most exclusive studios from 1895 to 1925. If his client records survived, they might reveal exactly who this family was and why she felt the need to hide something in plain sight. He had already made calls that morning, chasing threads of history. The Massachusetts Historical Society confirmed they held Hartwell's business records acquired in 1967, appointment books, client lists, perhaps even payment notes. Sarah felt the quiet pull of inevitability. "I'm driving to Boston tomorrow," she said, her decision as firm as the photograph's silver frame. "This mystery, it isn't going to solve itself." What would drive a mother in 1914 to hide a message in a family portrait? Was it fear of war, a personal betrayal, or something darker still? As you drift towards sleep, imagine the folded paper waiting through a century of silence, holding its secret until someone dares to look closely enough. The next morning unfolded grey, and still in Boston. The kind of morning when the air feels older than the day itself. Sarah stepped quietly into the climate-controlled archives of the Massachusetts Historical Society, her breath soft against the glass door as it clicked shut behind her. Rows of quiet boxes stretched out like silent witnesses, each one guarding a fragment of someone's forgotten life. The Hartwell Studios collection waited in 3 sturdy boxes, appointment ledgers, fragile client correspondence, and even delicate photographic plates that still shimmered faintly in the light. Sarah pulled the first ledger toward her, its leather cover worn smooth by decades of careful hands. She began to scan the pages for the year 1914 eyes, tracing neat, inked names and dates, the echoes of long-ago appointments. Then midway through March, the inked letters stopped her breath. March 15, 1914. Patterson family portrait. 2 p.m. Payment $12.50 premium sitting. Beneath it, an address 145 Beacon Street, Boston. Her pulse flickered. A premium sitting. The kind only the wealthy could afford Hartwell's most expensive service. Sarah's fingers trembled slightly as she lifted her camera and photographed the page. The path forward had revealed itself, but it felt less like discovery and more like stepping onto a bridge that might vanish behind her with every footfall. The next step was clear: find the Patterson family of 145 Beacon Street. But even as Sarah packed her notes, a faint weight settled in her chest. What could drive a mother to hide a folded scrap of paper during what should have been a joyful family portrait? The Boston Public Library's genealogy department became her next sanctuary. Armed with the Beacon Street address, Sarah began weaving together the Patterson story from city directories, census sheets, and the brittle pages of newspaper archives. The 1910 census brought the first clear image: Thomas Patterson, 42, a textile merchant. His wife, Eleanor, 36. A son, William, 8. A daughter, Catherine, 5. The household employed 2 servants, an unmistakable sign of wealth in Boston's thriving textile years. City records revealed more. Thomas Patterson owned Patterson and Associates, a textile importing firm with deep ties to New England's mills. Fine fabrics from European manufacturers passed through his hands, fabrics that clothed Boston's wealthiest families. The Pattersons, it seemed, were securely anchored among the city's merchant elite. But as Sarah sank deeper into the yellowed columns of 1914 newspapers, the bright fabric of the Patterson reputation began to fray. In the Boston Globe of February 1914, a small notice in the business section caught her eye. Patterson and Associates faced difficulties amid changing European trade conditions. A few pages later, a sharper edge appeared in the Boston Herald, dated March 10, 1914, just 5 days before the family portrait. Local textile merchant Thomas Patterson questioned by federal investigators regarding suspected irregularities in import documentation. Sarah's heart quickened. The family had scheduled their expensive portrait while federal suspicion tightened around them. Suddenly, Eleanor Patterson's hidden scrap of paper took on a darker, heavier meaning. Was it evidence, a confession, a plea? A reference librarian, noticing Sarah's intense focus, approached with a quiet smile. Researching the Patterson textile scandal, she asked softly. Sarah looked up, startled. You know about it. It's a fascinating case, the librarian whispered, lowering her voice as if the walls themselves were listening. Thomas Patterson was convicted of customs fraud in 1915. The family lost everything: the home, the business, their place in Boston society. And Mrs. Eleanor Patterson. The librarian paused, letting the silence deepen. She disappeared shortly after the trial. Some say she fled to Canada with the children. Others believe something far more tragic happened. A chill rippled through Sarah. Whatever Eleanor had held in her hand during that March portrait now felt less like a simple keepsake and more like a lifeline. Perhaps the last trace of a woman standing at the edge of ruin. Driven by a tightening curiosity, Sarah's next stop was the National Archives branch in Boston, where the federal court records of 1914 and 1915 waited in cool, dusty quiet. The Patterson case file was thicker than she expected, a dense knot of investigative reports, witness statements, and carefully catalogued evidence. The deeper she read, the clearer the scheme became. Thomas Patterson had orchestrated a web of customs fraud over 3 years, systematically underreporting the value of imported textiles, forging documents, bribing port officials. The numbers revealed a slow, deliberate theft of thousands of federal tariff dollars. But buried within the reports was something Sarah hadn't anticipated. A Treasury Department memorandum dated March 8, 1914, just 1 week before the family portrait stood out in stark black type. Evidence suggests Mrs. Eleanor Patterson maintained separate financial records and correspondence related to the import scheme. Recommend immediate search of family residence. The search had been scheduled for March 16, 1914, one day after the portrait. Sarah felt a heartbeat echo in the silent reading room. Eleanor Patterson had known. The portrait was not just a family keepsake, it was the final image of their life before the storm captured on the last day. Their home would remain untouched. In the evidence inventory from the March 16th search, Sarah found a telling note. Searched premises thoroughly. No additional documentation recovered. Subject may have destroyed or concealed relevant materials prior to search. A picture began to sharpen in Sarah's mind. Eleanor had hidden something in her hand during the portrait, something she could not bear to burn but dared not leave behind. Perhaps the photograph itself sent to relatives or stored safely was her chosen vault. One thin folder, labeled Unrecovered Evidence, held a single handwritten memo from the lead investigator. It read, Mrs. Patterson claims ignorance of her husband's activities, but witnesses report her presence during several suspicious meetings with foreign contacts. Her knowledge of the family's financial affairs appears extensive. Sarah photographed every document her mind, racing through possibilities like a lantern, swinging in a darkened hall. Court transcripts from Thomas Patterson's 1915 trial painted a haunting picture of the family's final months. Eleanor testified briefly in her husband's defense, insisting on her innocence, her words calm and measured. But the most unsettling discoveries lay hidden in the witness statements that never reached the courtroom. One came from Margaret Donnelly, the Patterson housekeeper. Mrs. Patterson was always writing letters, especially to people overseas, Donnelly recalled. She kept a special writing box locked and hidden. In the weeks before Mr. Patterson's arrest, she burned many papers in the fireplace. Another statement belonged to a neighbor, Robert Sinclair, whose testimony suggested nights of quiet unease. He had observed strange movements in the house shadows, pacing, long after the lamps should have been dark. Sarah closed the final folder, the hum of the archive lights sounding suddenly like a distant ticking clock. The hidden paper in the photograph was no longer just a curiosity. It was a message from a woman poised on the thin edge between loyalty and survival. A fragment of truth preserved in the narrow space between her fingers, waiting more than a century for someone to finally notice. What did Eleanor Patterson risk everything to carry into that single moment, frozen forever in silver and shadow? Was it a confession, a key to the fraud, or something meant for her children to one day discover? As you let the night settle in, imagine her calm gaze at the camera, her secret pressed against her palm, holding tight against a world about to unravel. The night before the family portrait, the garden at 145 Beacon Street held a silence as heavy as the spring air. A neighbor's testimony would later surface quiet but unforgettable. I saw Mrs. Patterson in her garden near midnight, he recalled. She carried a small bundle and seemed to be burying something beneath the rose bushes. Another voice from the past carried an even colder note. Miss Helen Rogers. Little Catherine Patterson's schoolteacher remembered a final encounter after Thomas Patterson's arrest. Mrs. Patterson came to collect Catherine, the teacher told investigators. She seemed distraught, kept whispering, "I have to protect what matters most." That was the last time anyone at the school saw either mother or daughter. Sarah followed the trail of those voices into April 1915, when Eleanor Patterson and her 2 children simply vanished. Police reports noted that they left their Beacon Street home with only personal belongings, no forwarding address, no explanation. A fragile thread surfaced briefly. 8-year-old William Patterson was briefly enrolled in a school in Burlington, Vermont, in May of 1915. But after only 2 weeks, the family disappeared once more, the paper trail dissolving into silence. Boston police investigated, but their final report offered little comfort. Mrs. Patterson's disappearance appears voluntary, it concluded. Yet one final sentence lingered like a shadow. Her knowledge of her husband's criminal activities and possible possession of undiscovered evidence makes her a person of continued interest to federal authorities. Whatever Eleanor had hidden in her hand on that March day in 1914, it had been important enough to risk everything. Sarah's breakthrough arrived not from an archive, but from the glowing screen of her laptop. While posting inquiries on genealogy forums, she received an email 3 days after leaving Boston. The subject line was simple: Patterson Family Inquiry. "I believe my grandmother may have been Catherine Patterson," the message began. The sender, a woman named Ruth Caldwell from Burlington, Vermont, continued. "Well, she always claimed her real name was Catherine, but she went by Carol Caldwell her entire adult life. She died in 1995, but left behind items that might interest you, including what she called her mother's secret." Sarah's hands shook as she dialed the number listed in the email. Ruth answered with the calm warmth of a retired schoolteacher, her voice carrying the careful steadiness of someone who had guarded a story for far too long. "My grandmother rarely spoke about her early childhood," Ruth explained. She said her father had been involved in some kind of trouble and that her mother saved important papers. She kept a small metal box her entire life, claiming it contained proof of the truth. Ruth agreed to meet Sarah the next day in Burlington. That night, Sarah lay awake in her hotel room, staring at the ceiling, as questions turned slowly in her mind. What could have been so precious, so dangerous, that a mother would carry it into exile and hide it for a lifetime? The following morning brought a soft Vermont mist as Sarah stepped into Ruth's cozy home. The air smelled faintly of cedar and old books. On a small table rested a metal box, no larger than a jewelry case, its surface dulled by time. On the lid, engraved in delicate letters, were the initials E.P. Eleanor Patterson. With a reverence that bordered on ceremony, Ruth opened the box. Inside lay several carefully wrapped treasures: a faded photograph, 3 folded documents, and a letter addressed simply to Catherine. "Grandmother made me promise to keep these safe," Ruth whispered. She said that someday someone would come looking for the truth. She always maintained that her mother was innocent and that her father had been protecting someone else. Sarah's fingers trembled as she unfolded the letter, the paper soft and fragile against her touch. The handwriting was elegant, yet hurried the date at the top unmistakable. March 15th, 1914, the very day of the family portrait. She began to read aloud, her voice almost breaking the hush of the room. My dearest Catherine, if you are reading this, then the truth has finally come to light. Your father is not the criminal the government believes him to be. The true perpetrator of the customs fraud is his business partner, Jonathan Harwick, who has been using your father's name and forging his signature for more than 2 years. I have proof of Jonathan's guilt correspondence with corrupt port officials, forged documents, and financial records showing payments your father never authorized. Jonathan threatened our family when your father began questioning discrepancies in the accounts. He vowed that if we exposed him, he would ensure your father's conviction for crimes he did not commit. Sarah's voice softened as she continued. Today we sat for what may be our final family portrait. Hidden in my hand is the key to a safety deposit box at the First National Bank of Boston box, number 247. Inside are the documents needed to prove your father's innocence and Jonathan's guilt. I could not risk keeping these papers in our home, knowing federal agents would search it. If something happens to us, you must retrieve this evidence when you are old enough. The bank manager, Mr. Charles Whitman, is a family friend. He knows the truth and will help you. Your father chose silence to protect us, believing that by accepting blame, he could keep us safe. But I cannot allow an innocent man's name to be destroyed forever. Remember, my darling Catherine, that courage sometimes means protecting the truth until the right moment comes to reveal it. The room fell into a long, trembling silence as Sarah reached the final line. Her eyes glistened, the weight of a century-old secret pressing softly into the present. The key Eleanor had concealed was not evidence of guilt, but of innocence proof, hidden in plain sight, preserved through a mother's desperate love. Ruth wiped her eyes with a quiet dignity. Grandmother always said her mother was brave, she murmured. She carried this letter her entire life, waiting for someone who would care enough to bring the truth back into the light. The following morning, Sarah and Ruth set out for Boston together. The small metal box rested securely in Sarah's briefcase, the initials EP catching faint glimmers of dawn. As the miles passed beneath their tires, Sarah could almost feel the heartbeat of history quickening the final steps of a journey that had waited more than 100 years to be completed. What would you have done if you were Eleanor Patterson holding a key that could clear a loved one's name, yet endanger everyone you loved? Would you reveal the truth or carry it into silence, waiting for a future you might never see? As night deepens, imagine the small weight of that metal key pressed into a mother's palm, carrying a century of courage and quiet defiance. The First National Bank of Boston no longer stood as it once had. By the 1960s, it had been absorbed by a larger financial institution, its marble halls replaced with modern offices and fluorescent lights. Yet deep in the bank's quiet records, something of the old world remained. Corporate archives confirmed what Sarah Mitchell and Ruth Caldwell had hoped. Safety deposit boxes from the original bank had been carefully transferred to the downtown main branch. Somewhere in those silent vaults, a box had been waiting for over a century. Bank manager Jennifer Walsh listened with quiet fascination as Sarah explained their unusual request. The stories sounded like something out of a forgotten novel, a family portrait from 1914, a hidden key, and a letter sealed away for generations. Jennifer tapped a polished fingernail against the ledger. Box 247, she murmured. It's been sealed for non-payment for decades. But with the proper documentation and given the historical significance? Yes. Yes, we can proceed. Moments later, Sarah and Ruth followed her through a series of echoing corridors into the heart of the bank's underground vault. The air grew cooler, the scent of old paper and metal mingling in a way that made time itself feel suspended. There, in a row of silent abandoned boxes, sat the one they had crossed states to find. When Jennifer inserted the century-old key, Eleanor Patterson's key, the one hidden so carefully in that family portrait, it turned with surprising ease. A soft click broke the silence, as if the lock had been waiting for this very moment. The lid opened to reveal a small trove of yellowed envelopes and folded papers, all wrapped in the faint scent of iron and age. Inside lay the truth Eleanor had promised her daughter. Letters between Jonathan Harwick and corrupt port officials, detailed payments, bribes, and carefully forged documents. Bank records confirmed secret accounts. Most damning of all was a practice sheet where Harwick had rehearsed copying Thomas Patterson's signature line after line until the imitation was perfect. Ruth lifted one letter with trembling hands. The date caught her eye. March 5th, 1914, just days before the Patterson family portrait was taken. The message was chillingly direct. If your husband continues asking questions about the import documentation Harwick had written, I will ensure he takes responsibility for irregularities he knows nothing about. Your family's reputation and safety depend on his cooperation. Ruth exhaled a shaky breath. Grandmother was right, she whispered. Her mother really was protecting the truth all along. Sarah carefully photographed every document, her historian's mind already framing how this revelation would echo beyond the Patterson family. Thomas Patterson had not been a criminal. He had been a husband and father who chose to shoulder a false guilt to keep his loved ones safe from a ruthless man. And Eleanor Patterson, once suspected of complicity, had been something far more powerful, a mother quietly preserving proof of her husband's innocence, knowing that someday, someone would be ready to listen. At the bottom of the box rested one final relic, a photograph. In it, Thomas Patterson and Jonathan Harwick stood shoulder to shoulder, smiling stiffly as they shook hands at the textile factory they once ran together. The bitter irony of that handshake lingered in the cold vault air. A frozen moment of trust betrayed. 6 months later, Sarah found herself standing at a polished wooden podium inside the Massachusetts Historical Society. The grand room was filled with historians, genealogists, and members of the Patterson family who had come forward after news of the discovery spread. Projected on the screen behind her was the very portrait that had begun it, all the 1914 image of a Boston family whose secrets had outlasted war scandal and time itself. She spoke softly, but with conviction, sharing how the documents from Box 247 had been authenticated by forensic experts and how each fragile page had rewritten a century of misunderstanding. The federal court system, though unable to issue a formal exoneration after so many years, publicly acknowledged Thomas Patterson's conviction as a miscarriage of justice. His name, once clouded by suspicion, now stood cleared in the historical record. Beside Sarah sat Ruth Caldwell, the granddaughter of the little girl in the photograph. Ruth had donated her grandmother's letter and the contents of the safety deposit box to the Historical Society. ensuring that future researchers could study the quiet bravery of a family who chose love and secrecy over public vindication. Dr. James Reed, who had first guided Sarah through Boston's archival maze, later revealed one final discovery. Jonathan Harwick, the architect of the fraud, had fled to South America in 1916, disappearing into history with his ill-gotten gains. His absence only deepened the truth of Eleanor's words and the quiet heroism of the family. He tried to destroy. As Sarah concluded her presentation, she displayed the original photograph once more. The audience leaned in, drawn to the subtle curve of Eleanor's left hand, the hand that had concealed a key through an entire sitting, daring anyone across time to notice. "This case reminds us," Sarah said gently, "that photographs are more than frozen smiles. They are messages left for those patient enough to look closer." Eleanor Patterson's key was never just a piece of metal. It was a mother's final act of love, a promise that truth, no matter how carefully hidden, would one day be found. In the front row, Ruth smiled through tears. The little girl in that photograph, her grandmother had carried her mother's secret through a lifetime. And now, more than a century later, the secret had done exactly what Eleanor intended. It had restored her family's honor. That 1914 studio portrait, once a simple keepsake of a prosperous Boston family, now stood as a quiet monument to maternal courage and the relentless patience of truth. A key in a mother's hand, unnoticed for generations, had waited for the right pair of eyes to see it, and for the right moment to change history forever.